There's another term that we perhaps don't pay enough attention to when reading through the Mirror Stage essay, and I'm going to highlight it. It's symbolic efficacy, or as it appears in Bruce Fink's translation, symbolic effectiveness. It's on page 77 of the Mirror Stage, and I'll read the quote, but here Lacan is going to relate it to imagos, the concept that we've spent a little bit of time talking about, and I think the relationship is important. Symbolic effectiveness to imagos. I'll say why I think so, and I'll also highlight the importance of the notion of symbolic efficacy. So let me say why I think it's important. We've already said that when he's using the notion of imago, it seems to involve a kind of dimension of change, as well as a kind of series of potential behaviors. It gives a kind of almost like a little behavioral schema and role, but it also seems to be able to point to the possibility of a shift or a change. Here's the sentence. For imagos, whose veiled faces we analysts see emerging in our daily experience, and in the penumbra of symbolic effectiveness. In the penumbra of symbolic effectiveness. In other words, that's to say that there is still the reoccurrence of imagos in the penumbra, in kind of the space around symbolic effectiveness. Or more simply put, there's a relationship of sorts between these imagos that analysts are seeing all the time, or let's say in this respect, a kind of enabling imaginary identification, which has a kind of template and maybe has a certain set of behavioral guidelines, so to speak, that come with it. What is the relationship between that and symbolic effectiveness? Well, here's my little gloss on what I think symbolic efficacy means, and it's kind of indebted to how Zizek reads Levi-Strauss, actually. But in Levi-Strauss, we have this notion of symbolic efficacy or effectiveness, or efficacy, keep on changing the term, and he gives this example of what happens when a woman is giving birth and someone who assists in this process gives a kind of symbolic language to help negotiate the real, the pain, the agony, the difficulties, the challenge of this process. You are starting out on a long journey. You're walking into a river. There's mountains all around. I'm slightly reinventing Levi-Strauss's example. I'm not being very precise, but the point, I hope, still works. We have, in other words, a kind of symbolic overwriting of the real of experience with terms, with a narrative set of formulations, which gives it a kind of momentum, but also that gives it a kind of form, that gives it a kind of sensibility. But the important point, I think, about symbolic efficacy is it's not just an overwriting of the world, but it can become kind of self-duplicating. So we could think of all sorts of different examples of this. My really kind of minor, silly one is to think about what happens when you have the holiday season at the end of the year. On the Christian calendar, this is Christmas, and everyone, not everyone, I suppose, but a lot of people end up being pulled into the like, well, now we've got to do this, now we've got to have this, now we've got to, whatever, have a glass of champagne at the New Year, or that's not actually Christmas, but you get what I'm saying. Is that we have a kind of symbolic overwriting of the real of experience or of a day in the year, which then comes to be experienced as such, and it brings with it a vague set of roles, tasks, even ways to enjoy that come with that. So back here to the symbolic effectiveness, I think it's interesting that imagos are linked to symbolic effectiveness in that way. But what's also crucially important about this, we haven't stressed it enough just yet, but as opposed to very early theorizations of the mirror stage, where it seems to be very much about the imaginary, Lacan is going to increasingly, and it's already happening here precisely with the symbolic effectiveness, he's trying to also say that, all right, there's this imaginary stuff happening, an identification with an image, but that whole process is fundamentally reliant upon or structured by symbolic elements. And that's why we always have, the routinely reiterated fact that it's not just that the child looks in the mirror and has the jubilant experience of assuming an image. That very process is directed by a voice, by someone who can hold up the child and maybe offer some commentary on what facets of the mirror image are important. But nevertheless, just wanted to highlight that notion of symbolic efficacy. Now let's turn over the page, and now hopefully some of these bits and pieces of the concepts that we've been introducing will start to come together. On page 78, we have a line which pulls together some of the concepts that he's really utilized. The function of the mirror image thus turns out, in my view, to be a particular case of the function of imagos. Okay, we've seen imagos, which is to establish a relationship between an organism and its reality, or as they say, between the Innenwelt and the Umwelt. So the Innenwelt, the inner world of experience, and the Umwelt of environment, these are terms that come from, a phenomenological register, a phenomenological lexicon of how to describe things. And they're now being utilized alongside the notion of an imago. So it's kind of a trademark Lacanian gesture. I'm taking concepts from one domain of scholarship and philosophy and psychiatry, and I'm utilizing them alongside a Freudian concept. And when I do that, by the end of it, I'll have a concept of the imaginary, which kind of somehow extends beyond the domains of each of these concepts. But here then comes another crucial point, which we've reiterated already. In human beings, however, this relationship to nature is altered by a certain hescience at the very heart of the organism, a primordial discord. I emphasized before that there's something of the real, of a kind of incompatibility or impossibility or incommensurability already in this notion of the mirror stage. And let me say that I think this is also where you start to see a sense, a conceptual, and I think also ethical emphasis on the real, on what doesn't work, on incommensurability, which differs from a more phenomenological sensibility, at least in my experience, which would want to highlight how these two things might harmonize. Innenwelt and Umwelt might be brought into a harmonized relation. I think the Lacanian move would be to say, well, they are sometimes experienced as such, as existing in a kind of functional sense of working together, maybe even in a harmonized sense, but that's not the ultimate reality of what's going on. And that point is made pretty strongly a little bit further down on page 78 when he says, the shattering of the Innenwelt to Umwelt circle gives rise to an inexhaustible squaring of the ego's audits. Squaring of the ego's audits. In other words, it's almost like the ego is caught in this constant attempt to pull together Innenwelt and Umwelt. But that attempt, the shattering of the circle, as Lacan puts it, is something that can never be completed and never quite be done. So there's an incommensurability that underlies this very experience. Whew. Fine. Then on the bottom of page 78 is another fantastic point to highlight. And I think it's kind of useful because we've been talking about spatiality, space, environment. And it's a rich point, and of course it'll be familiar to those who've read the essay before, fields of battle, inner castles. Anyways, here it goes. The I function is symbolized in dreams by a fortified camp, even a stadium, distributing between the arena within its walls and its outer border of gravel pits and marshes two opposed fields of battle, where the subject bogs down in his quest for the proud, remote inner castle, whose form, sometimes juxtaposed in the same scenario, strikingly symbolizes the id. So it's great because I think part of what's being done there is to say that even the experience or the dreamlike experience of these differentiated spatialities, okay, one, fortified walls, a structure, fortified camp, a stadium, is a kind of pretend egoic construction of coherence, which is always abutted by and close to, surrounded by the marshes, the bogs, the, what does he call it here, gravel pits, which are alongside one and which strikingly resemble the id. So it's kind of a nice way to think about, actually it's a nice way to get better at listening to certain facets of dreams where these kinds of almost geographical, architectural, spatial metaphors will presumably be present. But there's this contrast between the pretend, hopeful, wished-for structure and stability of these structures, architectural forms, and the id components that go nearby it. Callum Neal has got a nice remark in this respect, and he just says, Lacan draws our attention here to the fact that where there is ego, there is also necessarily id. And I suppose we would see that, just to take it back to the more bodily domain, for every image or for every moment, and when there's a kind of ideal ego coherence image of my own looking goodness and holding it together, a good hair day, you could say that that's always potentially subtended by the bogs and marshes. In other words, by those experiences when the body does not particularly hold, where there is much more of a fragmentation and a discordance and an inconsistency at the bodily experiential level. So, great, we've made the point about the spatiality and how that may appear in dreams and how we find ego and id together. But it's really fascinating to me that after he's spoken about the remote inner castles and forms and so on, he says, similarly, though here in the mental sphere we find fortified structures constructed, the metaphors for which rise spontaneously as if deriving from the subject's very symptoms, to designate the mechanisms of obsessive neurosis, inversion, isolation, reduplication, undoing what has been done, and displacement. So it's kind of a mouthful because he uses a couple of these mechanisms right on the heels of one another. But let's just note that and then also say that part of what's being described in those dreams, where there's this kind of pretend necessity of the fortifying walls, seems to have a certain affinity with obsessional neurosis. So here he is. Designate the mechanisms of obsessional neurosis: inversion, isolation, reduplication, undoing, and displacement. So it sounds like there's a little bit more further conceptual work to link all of those things, but I suppose what I find useful for clinical work in reading the Lacanian stuff is when you see these defenses, how they relate back to structure, and getting better at identifying which of these defenses is in place. Right, on page 79, once again, we have the description of paranoiac alienation. He says he wants to talk about Anna Freud's major book, and he talks about hysterical repression and returns at a more archaic stage than obsessive inversion, which itself is interesting. Hysterical repression and its returns are occurring at a more archaic stage than obsessive inversion. And of course, one way of taking that up is to say, well, that sounds like a riff on Freud's famous idea that obsessional neurosis is itself a dialect of hysteria. But it's just an interesting moment where hysterical repression is given a kind of earlier time frame. But what I'm really trying to build to is this notion. He talks about the paranoiac alienation that dates back to the time in which the specular I turns into the social I. This is something we spent a little bit of time on. The specular I turning into the social I in the foregoing lectures. But once again, the paranoiac notion, we spoke about paranoid knowledge without properly defining it, and here we have paranoiac alienation. And you'll remember when we spoke about paranoid knowledge, we linked it to transitivism, we linked it to desire, but here now we're hearing paranoiac alienation. And I think that adds a further feature to how we're going to go about thinking about paranoid knowledge, because the whole process of the mirror stage is about alienation. It's about taking something from the outside, which is fundamentally alien and external, as a kind of pretend basis for an image of what I will make to be myself. And if that's the case, then alienation, the outsideness, the dependence on this thing from outside is fundamental to the process, and that also is going to shed a light on why there's something paranoiac about this. Let's think a little bit about that. I'm fundamentally reliant on my very being, on things that are around, that are outside me, things that other people may try to possess, and things which thus mean that although I'm fundamentally reliant on these things for my being, they may also be somehow taken away by others, and thus I'm both vulnerable, fundamentally reliant, even in the very moment of my narcissistic attempt to constitute myself. All right, so I wanted to note just briefly as well this quote, which seems to build on that, and then what we'll do is we'll look to how Danny Nobis describes the notion of paranoid knowledge, which is really helpful. So also on page 79, Lacan says, it is this moment which decisively tips the whole of human knowledge, savoir, into being mediated by the other's desire, constitutes its objects in an abstract equivalence due to competition from other people, and turns the I into an apparatus to which every instinctual pressure constitutes a danger. Yet again, a pretty dense passage, but this moment when the specular I turns into the social I, a dialectic that will henceforth link the I to socially elaborated situations. There's a lot of this intention to how the specular image then tips into a kind of more socially elaborated social I situation. But the decisively tipping of the whole of human knowledge into a being mediated by the other's desire constitutes its objects in an abstract equivalence due to competition from other people, and turns the I into an apparatus to which every pressure constitutes a danger. So these objects which are around me, this scenario in which my egoic sensibility comes to take on a certain substantiality, means that they're always potentially, because I'm reliant on the desires of others, and because the objects around me, which in a sense are also part of who my imaginary ideal image are, could be taken away from others, away from me by others. That's why I think there's this emphasis on an abstract equivalence due to competition from other people. Abstract equivalence in all these objects that in part constitute me and are part of me in an abstract equivalence due to the competition from other people. Let's try and say that in more straightforward terms. Please, goodness, that would be helpful. And this is where I think the Danny Nobis quote is extremely helpful. So, during the 1950s, says Nobis, Lacan theorized desire along Hegelian lines, although he rephrased the Kojèvian Hegelian desire for recognition as desire is a desire for or of the other. Here comes the crucial point. In Lacan's view, a human being can only feel recognized when he or she is desired by another human being, or when the object he or she desires is also desired by somebody else. Let's pause that. When he or she is desired by another human being, or when the object he or she desires is always desired by someone else. In other words, we're always in a kind of chain of desires. I don't desire something unless it's desired by someone else. Okay, there's like a whole chain of different desiringnesses that I locate myself in. And furthermore, I only feel recognized, I only come into being, in a sense, when I'm desired by another human being. So there's a fundamental reliance or codependence, you might be able to say, when the domain of desire is happening. But back to the Nobis quote, desire for an object, desire to know an object, must be mediated by another desire. In short, no human being desires what no human being desires. One only desires something because it's also desired by somebody else. Lacan designated this mechanism as paranoic knowledge. So I hope that starts to piece these things together. I'm both fundamentally reliant on others for my desire. To come into being as a human being, I need to be desired. But what that also means is that I'm fundamentally locked into competition because what I desire is also desired by others. And it also means that I'm vulnerable to others. The very nature of what I desire and what I constitute as a certain type of knowing is fundamentally reliant on others around me. And that is, in a sense, the paranoid constitution of subjectivity within the world, to always be fundamentally reliant on my very being, on what others are desiring. Actually, you could argue that maybe the first major psychoanalytic contribution that Lacan makes prior to the mirror stage is precisely this notion of paranoid knowledge. Dylan Evans's introductory dictionary to Lacanian psychoanalysis has some important comments. He says, connaissance is always part of méconnaissance, in the same way that you could say that for Lacan, the very effective recognition, or going back to the mirror stage, the jubilant assumption of that is me, that recognition is never fully separable from misrecognition. They're part and parcel of the same kind of thing. In fact, in these moments of recognition, we're always fundamentally reliant on a misrecognition. In exactly the same way, connaissance, this imaginary domain of knowledge, is never fully extricated from méconnaissance, the imaginary knowledge that the person has of themselves. So when we're talking about imaginary knowledge or paranoic knowledge, is a type of self-knowledge founded on mirage-like fantasies of wholeness, of subjective bodily integration and self-mastery. So this is what gives it an imaginary dimension, and now we'll start to see that it's also paranoiac in a certain way. Why so? Well, according to Dylan Evans, there is always a co-birth, a connaissance of ego and other. And imaginary knowledge is called paranoid knowledge by Lacan, says Evans, because it has the same structure as paranoias. Both involve a delusion of absolute knowledge and mastery, and because of the preconditions of all human knowledge, that one of the preconditions of all human knowledge is the paranoic alienation of the ego, right? So one of the preconditions of human knowledge is the paranoic alienation of the ego, just to reiterate that second point. And the fact that there's a co-birth means that both in the assertion of a subjectivity and in the assertion of a kind of knowledge, we are always already, as it were, implicated, overlapping within the domain of the other. We could say that the key to grasping how knowledge, connaissance, is paranoic lies with the notion of alienation, which of course is an irreducible condition of the ego as such. It's also useful here to draw on a quote from Stein van Heuler. He speaks about the externally oriented basis of self-knowledge, which is constructed via the taking on of images and units of information alien to the subject. I like the units of information alien to the subject in that quote of Van Heuler's. This helps us to understand that the libidinal dynamism that qualifies paranoic in relationship to knowledge is involved in the fact that there's always this dependence. Just as the subject needs images to introduce effects of cohesion and wholeness to their inchoate and fragmentary nature of their experience, so they need units of information, or if we want to extend the point, objects, instances of imaginary knowledge, so as to create the semblance of mastery and control. In both such cases, we can expect an ego-affirming response to accompany the uptake of these resources, which are experienced as being crucial to the very being of the subject who experiences them. So we could bear in mind here that within the imaginary register, not only do we have the alienation that I am fundamentally dependent on others, but there's also the zero-sum logic of it is either him or me. There can only be one within the imaginary domain. Now, if we keep that in mind, we'll see how paranoid knowledge and its accompanying aggressivity is a constituent element of the ego. Let's end then with this unusually, I think, fairly clear and illustrative point that Lacan makes, which is, I think, will help weave some of these crucial ideas together. All human knowledge stems from the dialectic of jealousy, says Lacan. This is from Seminar 3. All human knowledge stems from the dialectic of jealousy, which is a primordial manifestation of communication. What takes place between two young children involves the fundamental transitivism expressed by the fact that one child who has beaten another can say, "The other beat me." It's not that he is lying, he is the other, literally. This occurs because the human ego is the other. In the beginning, the subject is closer to the form of the other than to the emergence of his own tendency. He is originally an inchoate collection of desires. There you have the true sense of the expression fragmented body. And the initial synthesis of the ego is essentially an alter ego. It is alienated. The desiring human subject is constructed around a center, which is the other, insofar as he gives the subject his unity. And the first encounter with the object is with the object as object of the other's desire. And I think with that, the sense that I initially am another, we start to appreciate why what the other knows or seems to know or what the other does has a crucial significance for me and could also be seen as being in competition and detracting from me. This, I think, is the basis of this idea of the necessarily paranoid quality of an ego and of the paranoid quality that qualifies human knowledge and human desire in its relationship to the world.